I feel a little bit today like the reader for Professor Levinson's address yesterday. He couldn't be here. One man was filling in for someone who couldn't make it to a conference, and he said before he began his speech, I feel a little bit today, I see that window back there where evidently one of the panes of glass is missing, and the custodial staff seems to have remedied the situation by putting in a piece of cardboard. He said, I feel a little bit like that piece of cardboard, you know. I don't think I'm going to let in much light, but at least I'm going to try and keep out the cold. And he went through the address, and afterwards one person came to him and kind of tapped him right in the center of his chest and said to him, "Don't you ever say anything like that again. You're not a piece of cardboard, you're a real pain." And we'll see how much pain we can produce this next 3 hours. I'm going to go through this a bit rapidly. What you have in this document is not my speech. It is a chapter from another book that I wrote, which you would all do well to buy. And I say that with great prideful humility. If you want to know something about the Bible, this is my attempt. This is the book I wish I would have had earlier in my life. And this is my attempt to make sense of the Bible as a whole. And the chapter on John that I've given you is intended to give you some of my understanding of the dynamics of the book in somewhat the same way as our previous two presenters have done. That is, some broader outlines to things. Why are light and darkness so important? How does the gospel parallel in parts the book of Genesis? What are the signs? And then getting into the farewell discourse, here's where I spent my time on my PhD dissertation, looking at the chiastic structure of the farewell discourse. So you can buy that book too. I'm going to give you the essence of it today, so you really don't need to, but the other one is really, really worth getting. My thesis is basically this, that the farewell discourse in John's gospel is chiastically structured. Now, in order to get to that point, there are a number of steps we have to take, steps that have already been introduced to us along the way today. What I would say about this particular reading, here are some of my words. Read in this manner, John 13 through 17 takes on a different character than it would if understood primarily as a linear discourse. For one thing, the vine and branches teaching of 15 verses 1 through 17 becomes the apex of its development, proclaiming the dominant theme that spiritual unity with Jesus, summarized a number of times in the phrase, "abide in me," is at the center of the discourse, shaping and pervading the surrounding material. Also, the repetitive themes of betrayal, Jesus leaving, the promise of the Spirit as advocate, and the character of the disciples' interaction with the world, initially stated in chapter 13 and 14, become paired in a meaningful way with their counterparts in chapters 15 and 16. Each of these themes becomes an extension of the abide in me injunction of 15 verses 1 through 17, explicating its significance in one of several ways. And finally, there is, in this chiastic reading of the discourse, an understanding of the foot-washing scene, which serves as a prelude to the discourse proper, as being a counterpart to the prayer of chapter 17. If union with Jesus is the organizing theme of the discourse, the disciples enter the discourse through a visible expression of Jesus' desire for their intimacy and leave with a spiritual expression of that same desire. Although this reading of John 13 through 17 is similar in various elements to other chiastic proposals, some of which I do pursue and probe further in my studies, it is rooted in the dual assumption that both the historical development of the text and its current form are of significance for interpretation. As a result, it serves to provide a cohesive understanding of the text in its received shape, which is the goal of synchronic interpreters, while at the same time encouraging the investigation of the historical criticism to provide insight into the redactional development of the literary panels of the discourse, the emphasis of diachronic interpreters. In this manner, the reading of the farewell discourse chiastically brings resolution to many of the issues of interpretation that have stood between diachronic and synchronic approaches. Now, the way that I get to this is through a number of steps. And first I talk about Lund's, I should give you the benefits. There are the benefits that I just talked about. And you will be able to see these in my paper when it's published. These are the things that Lund brought to light in his initial investigations of chiasm in the New Testament, chiasmus as he called it. Got it wrong, but that's okay. Chiasm, there's no chi in the Greek language, there's only a chi, right? So chiasm is really the word that one shouldn't use. Lund began to look at a number of passages and see some of these things. He eventually elucidated 7 theses. The center of a chiastically shaped pericope is always the turning point. The thought shifts at the center, often to an antithetic thought, only to return to the previous line of argument or topic development. Identical ideas are distributed across the given passage at the extremes and center. Some ideas are redistributed in the second half as if deliberately reiterated. Certain terms appear to gravitate toward the center of the passage. Larger units are frequently introduced and concluded by frame passages, and chiastic developments are frequently interspersed with linear progressive lines. These became essentially laws for him, which were challenged and updated and amended along the way. At first, they seemed very helpful, but Culpeper was one who said that Lund's laws failed to provide a clear set of criteria for identifying clues that might signal chiastic intent. If there is chiasm in a passage, whether it's intentional or it's part of the psychological method of storytelling or development of poetry, there should be some clues that indicate here it is or here it is not. And so Clark, following Culpeper's challenge, began to identify some things. According to Clark, chiastic repetition, parallelism, and centering may be found in any or several of all of these dimensions of a passage: its content, its structure, its choice of words, its setting, and theology. For Clark, chiasm might be found on several levels of literary expression, and though he doesn't make entirely clear the precise tools which may be used in assessing each of these dimensions, his analysis of Lund's general approach for parallel repetition in several categories broadens the possibility for the search of chiasm, while at the same time it called for more clarity when one begins to investigate that. The result of these investigations led to the next phase, and that was Thompson's rewriting of the laws proposed by Lund, and that's what you have here. For Thompson, chiasms frequently exhibit a shift at or near the center. Chiasms are sometimes introduced or concluded by a frame passage. Passages which are chiastically patterned sometimes also contain directly parallel elements. Identical passages may occasionally be distributed in such a fashion that they occur at the extremes of the passage and also again at the center of a given chiastic system. Balancing elements are normally of approximately the same length, and the center often contains the focus of an author's thought. This led Thompson to say a couple of things. First, Thompson said the chiasm will be present in the text as it stands and should not require any new emendation or movement in the text in order to recover something. Either it's there or it's not. And if it's not there, that's okay. The text still is there, but there's no chiasm. And you can live without a chiasm, believe it or not. It's possible. Second, said Thompson, the symmetrical elements will be present in precisely inverted order. He really emphasized the need for having balance in the elements across the center. Third, said Thompson, the chiasm will begin and end at a reasonable point. Here was something that, we have to think about, because as the study of chiastic passages or proposed chiasms in literary passages expands and expands, there are limits. We all know that it's possible to juggle one orange, okay? And probably at least half of us would be able to do that. A number of us might be able to juggle 2 oranges, and some among us have the gift of juggling 3 oranges. There might even be a few of us who can juggle 4, 5, 6, or 8. There will come a point at which we will no longer be able to juggle more oranges. And one of Thompson's criteria is this: there is a point at which chiasm no longer makes sense, precisely because if it is to be an organizational tool, one must be able to comprehend its organization, okay? So you may try to find extensive chiasms that extend well beyond several chapters, but be very, very careful. You're excluding about 99.9% of the population in their ability either to assess that or even use it in a meaningful way. If chiasm is to be a meaningful tool of communication, then it needs to be a meaningful tool of communication. And a chiasm is not something that we need to spend years and years assessing, but within some reasonable amount of time ought to be able to see naturally flowing as an organizational principle within the text. Now, having said that, Thompson limited the extent of chiasms to 15 lines or less. And obviously, I disagree with him there, because the farewell discourse in John's Gospel is slightly more than 15 lines. In fact, it's quite a few. What Thompson does suggest is that there should be we should pay attention to centering and balance. I'm going to zip through a bunch of this stuff. What happened next is that others began to say, in response to Thompson's limitation of the extent of chiasm to 15 lines, "Are you sure? Are you sure?" And that's where a couple of others entered into the discussion. Two persons, Porter and Reed, published an article in which they also suggested that there may be limits to the length to which a chiastic passage could be developed. And Craig Blumberg then responded to them, saying in an article that there are criteria, if we pay close attention to them, that will help us develop an understanding of macrochiasms. No one who studies literature generally, no one who studies biblical literature denies that there is the reality of chiasm in terms particularly of poetry, as we saw so nicely this morning also in Mesoamerica, and also in short storytelling. For instance, Ehud the Judge. The story of Ehud the Judge in Judges chapter 3 is built very clearly chiastically. It's a short story, but every point in the first half of the story is redeveloped in a reverse way in the second half, and the point of the story is in fact a large point. It's a small point, but it's a long point. It happens to be the point of his dagger as he thrusts it into Eglon, king of Moab's belly. That's the point of the story. And while the story of Ehud the Judge is meaningful with or without that chiastic understanding, it becomes brilliant when one understands that the whole thing is focused on that point, the center of the chiasm. Similarly is Joshua chapter 2, the story of Rahab and the spies sent out. The story intrudes on the flow of the literary development of the book of Joshua. At the end of chapter 1, the Israelites are ready to move into the promised land, but instead suddenly comes this story which takes at least 10 days or longer. It has to take that long just from the details of the story. Why is it put there? Because as the story is developed chiastically, every aspect of the movement of the spies in the first half is repeated in verse order in the second half, including the fact that Rahab saves them twice. Read the story, it's there. And at the very center of the story is the testimony of Rahab. Who's Rahab? She's a prostitute, we're told. But prostitution not in the kind of night walkers on city streets. She's a participant in the official shrines of the cultic gods of Jericho. In other words, she's in the employ of the gods of this place. And she makes the testimony that we know that your God is God in heaven above and on the earth beneath. In other words, the center is very important for the Israelites who are passing into the land to know that they are not the ones who are going to take the land, but they are instead the ones who are following the one who owns the land. And understanding that dimension of the story makes all the difference in interpretation. That becomes the point of the point. And you won't read that linearly. You'll read it chiastically. So there are very important things about this. Now, Bloomberg suggested that it's possible to find this already in Old Testament passages, and he is a New Testament scholar, so he was more concerned about New Testament. Here are his suggestions for movement from an understanding of the reality of microchiasms to the possibility of macrochiasms. There must be a problem in perceiving the structure of the text in question, which more conventional outlines fail to resolve. This, to me, is extremely important, and this is why I looked at the farewell discourse in John. So many proposals have been given, and none of them satisfy all of those involved in the research because the parameters, as has been mentioned already, are very complex. One of the things that chiasm does is it allows some of the other approaches to understanding the gospel as a whole to stand without people being necessarily on the same page about who Jesus is or what the gospel is about, but understanding literarily how the farewell discourse functions. There must be clear examples of parallelism between the two halves. Verbal parallelism as well as conceptual parallelism should characterize most, if not all, of the corresponding subdivisions. The verbal parallelism should involve central or dominant imagery or terminology. Both the verbal and conceptual parallelism should use words and ideas not regularly found elsewhere. Notice this. You and I have very limited vocabularies. Even if we go to Brigham Young University, we used very limited vocabularies. And repetition of words does not indicate chiasm, because you have already used a lot of words several times. The issue is, can these repetitions of words begin to group themselves in such a way that they are not so much found elsewhere, and they are, in fact, kind of the highlight of the relationship between the various dimensions of this passage, a really critical thing. That's why it's not good to go looking for chiasm everywhere. Chiasm, like love, needs to have its times, okay? Multiple sets of correspondences between passages opposite each other and the chiasm, as well as multiple members of the chiasm, are desirable. The outline should divide the text at natural breaks. The center of the chiasm, which forms its climax, should be a passage worthy of that position. And finally, ruptures in the outline should be avoided if at all possible. And Bloomberg says that the more that these things hold true for any investigation, the more likely a macrochiasm is in play. He shows this in his own analysis of 2 Corinthians 1, verse 12 through 7, verse 16, a very interesting passage. And then he goes on to explain how these things work out in his passage. Looking for reflexive parallelism in John 13 through 17, I started this as seeking to lead a Bible study in Nigeria. And one of the things that happened as I was reading through the farewell discourse is not only reading again so many parallels, but seeing that the words were repeated in a number of places. One of the most maddening things was that when Thomas asked Jesus, "Where are you going?" Jesus says, "I'm going away." Thomas says, "Where are you going?" And a little bit later, Jesus says, "Now I'm going away, yet none of you asked me where you are going." There are all sorts of things like that. When it comes down to it, these kinds of parallels seem to emerge. And when the evidence is weighed, this is the kind of solution that I came to, providing an overall macro chiasm to the farewell discourse in John's Gospel. What is the benefit of this? The chiastic reading of John 13 through 17 presented here results in an interpretation of the farewell discourse that addresses a number of important issues in fourth gospel studies. It offers, for instance, an intelligible role for the repeated love command, showing it to be part of the chiastic framing and centering of the discourse as a whole. Furthermore, it highlights the significance of the vine and branches teaching in 15 verses 1 through 17, allowing it to stand prominently as the turning point around which the discourse is built, and using its metaphor as the guiding principle by which the rest of the teachings of the discourse hold together. Finally, it balances the introductory narrative shaped by its expression of union with Jesus as an entrance into the hour of glory with the concluding prayer where once again union with Jesus is shown to take place in the experience of the hour of glory. Indeed, this approach has the potential for bringing together some of the best understandings developed by the otherwise divergent synchronic and diachronic readings of John 13 through 17. Each of these readings is based on a linear movement of either the text or some perceived psychological development behind the text. The synchronic readings too quickly dismiss the disjunctures of the passage at its literary level as if these do not much matter. The diachronic readings, on the other hand, cannot seem to find a comprehensive understanding of the text as it stands, focusing instead upon the meaning of portions of the discourse and the presumed history. If, however, the sections of the discourse, as they have been collected and edited in the final redaction, hold together in a chiastic reading, the disjunctions take on new significance. The strange ending of chapter 14, "Arise, let's go," and they don't, can be recognized as both a lingering interaction of redactive editing as well as a signal announcing the move from one section to the next, perhaps even hinting at some multiple levels of meaning that Brody suggested, particularly with reference to the crowning apex of chiastic design that follows in the vine and branches teaching of 15 through 1 through 17. The repetitious elements of the discourse begin to make sense as parallel teachings on common themes. The character of the vine and branches teaching becomes more obvious in its role as the chiastic pivot, shaping the flow of meaning for the discourse as a whole. Jesus' ministry is one that incorporates the disciples into the glory he shares with the Father. He creates the context in which they will abide in him, producing a community of mutual love. If they should have failed to abide in him, life becomes very dark. In view of Jesus' imminent departure, therefore, abiding in Jesus takes on an eschatological overtone. The Parakletos, the advocate, the Spirit, becomes the spiritual link by which the disciples are able to abide in physically absent Jesus. I tell my students this is the Wi-Fi. And threats to disrupting this linkage create a challenging context for living faithfully. This chiastic reading of the discourse goes beyond previous approaches to John 13 through 17 in several ways. First, it shows the significance of the central teaching of the vine and branches as the focus of the passage rather than just a thematic turn along the way. Move on. Second, the prominent sections that begin the outward union of the disciples with Jesus through the washing of the foot washing scene, and in the end, the inner union of the disciples with Jesus through the sanctification offered in his prayer in chapter 17. The discourse are understood as parallel explications of the central theme, abide in me. The discourse holds together in this reading, and the foot washing scene is directly linked to the theology of this passage. Similarly, the prayer in chapter 17 is neither the climax nor the summary of the discourses. Instead, it functions to conclude the discourses as a sort of reflection to the foot washing scene, confirming the intimate connection between Jesus and his disciples. Third, the otherwise cumbersome repetition of themes, from the small references focusing on denial to the larger investigations of the work of the Spirit, would be understood in this reading as a means by which the flow of the discourse in its entirety would be shepherded along a meaningful movement, ascending and descending stairs, bringing the reader upward or down from the central thrust of the whole. In this manner, a chiastic reading of the Johannine farewell discourse provides new insight. If the text of the fourth gospel, as it has come to us with the farewell discourse developed in its present formation, is a finished product designed to convey meaning and significance related to the person and teachings of Jesus, the chiastic reading of John 13 through 17 presented here offers an interpretive approach that can provide a new way in which to bring together the insights provided by both diachronic and synchronic readings of the text. Moreover, it encourages recognition that the multiple sections of the farewell discourse reflect each other and build upon one another in a manner that allows the whole to become more than the sum of its parts. Amen and amen.